потрібен буде переклад, то позаду вас є перекладач. Пан Михайло, вам переклад потрібен? Переклад не потрібен? Якщо потрібен, ззаді клас. Добрий день, я вітаю всіх.
Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Olga Atamanova, and it's my pleasure to see everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. It's been 10 years of the war, and today is day 750 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And I would like to start our event with thanking the representatives of all the mass media who give publicity to the truth about our heroic resistance. Thank you very much for what you're doing. Today we have invited all of you for a very important presentation. We will be talking about the strategy for the release of illegally detained civilians and finding missing persons as a result of Russian aggression. So let me introduce our speakers. Joining us are Oleksandra Matviychuk, head of the Center for Civil Liberties. Also joining us is Mykhailo Savva, member of the Expert Council in the Center for Civil Liberties, PhD, and Victoria Petruk, representative of the Coordination Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War. Good morning. It's no secret to anybody that the civilian hostages have become one of the most important challenges of this war, the most complicated challenges. So to what extent this strategy is going to help us to deal with this issue? Ms. Oleksandra, let's give the floor to you. Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event and everybody who came here today to discuss the strategy. Let me mention right away that the content of the strategy will be presented by Mr. Mykhailo Savva, one of the authors of the strategy, and I would like to talk about the context to overcome which this strategy was developed. So let me start with the problem of the illegally detained civilians. We've started facing this problem not on the 24th of February 2024, but from February 2014. Us in Center for Civil Liberties, we were the first human rights organization who in the end of February 2014 sent the first mobile team to Crimea, and then our mobile team started working in Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and back then we started witnessing this illegal practice of torturing, abduction, sexual violence, and murder of civilians in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And back then we were facing the situation when the legal tools were not efficient or were not working at all. And we had to add something else to the legal tools to change the situation on the strategic level, and we were surveying hundreds of people who were out of the Russian captivity. We submitted dozens of reports to United Nations, Council of Europe, OSCE, European Commission, and other international organizations, but all that practice was continuing all those 8 years before the full-scale invasion. And back then, on the third or fourth year of the war, we realized that we have to change the strategy, and we've started organizing the global campaigns to exercise pressure on the Russian Federation so they release the people who were illegally abducted. And one of the brightest examples was Save Oleksandra campaign to set Ukrainian film director Oleksandra free. Back then, as Ukrainians, we tried for the first time the practice of asynchronous demonstrations and manifestations in different countries of the world. And as a result of this pressure, we've got the necessary resolutions of the European Parliament and Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE, and we were seeing it as a big victory when European Parliament put together the list of political prisoners that was maintained by our organization. But the situation has changed dramatically since 24th of February 2022, not because this evil has multiplied and spread over the major territory of Ukraine and the number of illegally abducted civilians had grown multifold, and only within our initiative Tribunal for Putin we have a database that we maintain with other civil organizations. We have documented more than 4,000 cases of such illegal abductions. Also, the number of places of detention has grown, I mean, both in temporarily occupied territories and in the territory of Russian Federation. But there are two more important changes. First one I would like to illustrate with the example. Back in the year 2014, some may remember it, some may not. So Russia was deporting Ukrainian children from a foster home in Snizhne. Ukraine submitted the case to international court to bring the children back. So what is this example about? It's not about the fact that Russia is not a member of Council of Europe, and since September 2022 all the cases that were submitted after the date or brought to the court after the date cannot be brought to the European Court for Human Rights. But previously Russia was trying at least to act as a civilized country. They were trying to pretend they observe the standards of international law. They have respect to any awards of the international organizations, any rulings. But now whenever we go, we see that Russia does not comply with any such rulings. So it's a long game, and a very bright example is the interim ruling of the United States Court of Justice. Back in the year 2022, it obliged Russia to withdraw Russian troops from Ukraine, and we all remember that Russia had ignored this ruling. And another circumstance that results from the previous one is that for us, as a human rights people, the law should be united with something else, because on its own it just doesn't work temporarily. In future we will reinstate its effect, but to yield any result, we have to add in some more activities, either of economic, diplomatic, sanction or political nature. So this plus is something that our strategy is built upon, the strategy that will be presented by my colleagues. It should be of complex nature. It's related not only to the legal tools. And maybe the last thing I want to mention is that during all these years we were trying to develop some universal mechanisms, and now we ended up in a situation when we understand that this universal nature can only be provided by the law, and when the law doesn't work, it's all about creative solutions, individual approach. It's about some understanding, some profound understanding of specific details of every specific case, what would and would not work. So it's an exhausting work, a long play. So I want to thank our colleagues, Russian human rights activists, Russian lawyers who work with us on a daily basis on the cases of illegally abducted and detained citizens of Ukraine, the civilians who are being persecuted by Russia. And we know that about 2 weeks ago, our partner, the head of the board of Memorial Human Rights Center, was convicted for his human rights activity, and that part of his human rights activity, that is done by him and his colleagues is the work with Ukrainian human rights organizations to set free the civilians who were illegally detained and abducted, and to help them make it until that moment when they are set free, so they get an independent lawyer, so they get provided medical aid, so the tortures stop, so they have at least any connections to the outer world. And this work that takes years, where it's possible under conditions when law doesn't work, all I can say that this type of work, it makes me fond and makes me thank those who do this job. So I would like to give the floor to Mr. Mykhailo. I apologize, I will have to leave. In the middle, we have a lot of events going on today, and I try to catch up with all of them. So, Mr. Mykhailo, let's proceed to the presentation. Good morning, dear friends and colleagues. Let's start. My task today is to emphasize the key items in the document that since today is publicly available. It's available on the website of the Center for Civil Liberties, both in Ukrainian and English. There will be a link in the last slide of the presentation, but we need to emphasize a couple of things. As I've mentioned, we're talking about a document that we call the Strategy for Release of the Civilians. The official name is longer. The propositions regarding the ways of exercising pressure on the Russian Federation to release the citizens detained by Russian Federation as a result of the armed aggression. But the word strategy in this context, in this case, is correct, because we suggest to implement the system of activities that may result in setting free of a large number of individuals, large number of civilians. So it's a characteristic through figures. According to our estimates, at least 7,000 Ukrainian civilians are being kept hostages in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and Russian Federation. They are not just people who were deported, but they are people who were deprived of their freedom. This figure is very approximate, as I've mentioned, is the result of our estimates. So what is it made up of? We know the names of 1,600 civilians, 1,600, but it's not a comprehensive list. More than 28,000 Ukrainians are on the list of missing persons. About half of them are civilians. So we've calculated, based upon the experience of such wars as the one going on in Ukraine, which fraction of those people can be dead, which fraction of them can be already set free. So now we operate with the figure 7,000. So what is the way to set them free? Within 2 years of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine, during the prisoners of war exchanges, got 160 civilians returned. So with a pace like this, we will need 100 years to set all of them free. As you understand, that period is not satisfactory for us. Those people are not exchanged during the exchanges. They are being added as a bonus, and it's up to Russians to decide whom they return and based on what reasons. We don't know it. According to the research of the mission of the Organization of the United Nations, more than 90% of our citizens are subject to tortures in captivity, both military and civilians. For Russians, it's really the only category, because in the cases when Russian authorities respond to the relatives of the civilians, they write that this or that person was detained for resistance to the special military operation. This is the wording they use with regard to their Ukrainian prisoners of war, the military. For them, it makes no difference. However, international humanitarian law clearly discerns civilians from military prisoners of war. Another aspect about the conditions of detention. All of them are being detained in prison conditions. So basically it's not a camp where a person can freely move under open sky. It's a cell that is locked 23 hours per day. If there is a walk outside, it's 1 hour maximum. I know what conditions they are. I know that there are two great problems. First of all, it's oxygen hunger. When oxygen is not enough in the cell, the level of immunity falls down, which results in a number of diseases like tuberculosis and sensory deprivation when you don't have any new senses, nothing new that impacts the psychological condition of a person. So in the majority of cases, the people are being underfed and deprived of medical aid. People lose health there, and we know about a number of terrible cases. So why do we confidently say that the civilians deprived of their freedom is an illegal phenomenon? The international humanitarian law contemplates the possibility of movement of the civilians, but there was no such movement. It contemplates specific procedure. It contemplates the possibility to contest the decision about this person as they are being sent somewhere. So there was no fact of internment. Then Ukrainians non-combatants are being kept in places of detention without court rulings. So there are no court awards, and that's very important. Recently, we found out about so-called legal procedure that Russia figured out for such cases. The decision to detain the civilians is being taken by the head of the regional department of Federal Security Bureau. And this same person every 3 months signs a resolution on extension of the term of detention. So again, if there is no criminal case, but in majority of the cases, 90% of the cases, there are no criminal cases about those civilians, contesting of such decisions is impossible. Even the lawyer cannot get to the detained person as long as there is no criminal case. When the Russian lawyers were coming to such confinement cells, when they were saying, we know there are civil Ukrainians, and they were saying, okay, so what's your status? There is no criminal case, so you're good to go. So those people, they are absolutely deprived of any connection with the outer world. In the majority of cases, they are deprived of opportunity to use the services of the lawyers. They have no legal status. They are disconnected from their families. Why this strategy is important in our opinion? Russian regime clearly understands that they violate their international humanitarian law. The war crimes for Russia is a way of waging the war. This is why just saying that they violate international humanitarian law, it makes no difference. We need something systemic, as Ms. Oleksandra was mentioned, a system of interrelated ways to exercise the pressure of a Russian Federation: diplomatic, legal, economic, humanitarian, all kinds of pressure. And this strategy is aimed to solve two principal tasks. First of all is to help these people to make it to the moment they are being set free, because I've mentioned about terrible conditions of detention, and the final task is to set them free, to set all of them free, all those 7,000 or more, if there are more. So who is the target audience, the key target audience? Those are the civilians who were not convicted by Russian courts and in relation to whom there are no criminal cases. In that case, we will demand setting them free without any preconditions and exchanges. This strategy rejects an option of exchange of Ukrainian civilians against someone else. There are such ideas in Russia. There is a group of parliamentary deputies in Russia who try to promote the idea of exchange of Ukrainian civilians against other Ukrainian civilians who were convicted in Ukraine for collaboration with the occupiers. It's a terrible idea because Russia has unlimited resource to replenish this exchange fund. Several millions Ukrainian citizens who live in occupied territories. And also there are other factors that render this idea impossible. This deputy group did not get any support from other representatives of Russian authorities for the time being. So who was developing this strategy? And a couple of words regarding the history of our attempts to implement it. There were such attempts. The authors are the experts from the Center for Civil Liberties and experts from the Coordination Headquarters for Treatment of Prisoners of War. And it's my pleasure to see some of those people here today. Last year, the Center for Civil Liberties offered this strategy to the authorities of Ukraine during the meeting of the task force of the coordination headquarters. It was happening on the 22nd of June, quite a symbolic date, but it's just occasional. Back then we didn't have the text of the strategy, but we had basic ideas and we were already starting to offer them to the Ukrainian authorities. And this year, on the 14th of February, we presented the full text of the strategy during the meeting of the task force of the coordination headquarters, during which we met the representatives of the Prosecutor General's office, Commissioner for Human Rights, and we also want to thank our colleagues from the civil sector for cooperation and ideas. So the key element of the strategy, it's really the key element because without it, all the rest will hardly work efficiently. Addressed with the demand to set the civilians free based on the fact that Russia violates the Convention Against Torture and other inhumane or humiliating ways of treatment or punishment. It's surprising, but Russian Federation is still a part of this convention. They ratified it. They've undertaken an obligation to fulfill this convention, but they do not fulfill it. Why? Because it's such a long detention of civilians that is the violation of this convention by itself. This detention is a type of cruel treatment, and as a first step, the application to the authorities of Russian Federation. This is the requirement of the convention. So basically Ukrainian authorities should first start the communication with Russia. We understand it's a difficult decision, but there is no other option that we see. The next step in case of refusal by Russia to demand the establishment of international arbitrage. That's the requirement of the convention, and if Russia does not agree the country within 6 months, the arbiter country, Ukraine, gets the right to report to the International United Nations Court. This is something that only Ukrainian authorities can do. Then the measures of legal impact, the so-called stop factors that decrease the pressure over Ukrainians who are currently being imprisoned, to identify the heads, the directors of the places of detention, and organize the criminal persecution of them in Ukraine and other countries. Ukraine has already started this process. We want to extend our appreciation to the Office of Prosecutor General, but the scale of this process is still very small. Yet another important thing is to create the conditions to issue an order by the International Criminal Court for illegal detention of the civilians. The International Criminal Court has already issued 2 orders for the deportation of children, for shelling of civil infrastructure, and we're waiting for the warrant for illegal detention of the civilians. The diplomatic influence. I'm not gonna list all of the items on the list of activities. And again, this list is not even comprehensive. It's not everything that we suggest, but we should use the capabilities of the United Nations, special reporters of the United Nations, including the reporter on violent abductions, and to establish communication with the donors of the International Committee of Red Cross. We were trying to establish the direct communication with the Red Cross. We understand the importance of this organization in terms of settlement of humanitarian issues, but it's a closed organization in my personal opinion, and we were not able to make it. They are a bit too conservative. Probably communication with the donors may help in this process. The economic influence activities, we need this tailored sanctions package, which I would call for the civilians. It wouldn't be the first and the last one, I hope, but it's necessary because the representatives of Russian authorities who violate the law are supposed to get a signal. You are in the crosshair, so just wait for it. So there are not only sanctions imposed by specific countries, but there are such powerful mechanisms as Global Magnitsky. There is a number of sanction tools that can be and have to be used. The humanitarian influence activities, we need an international information campaign 24/7. Unfortunately, this problem is given too little publicity in Europe, Australia, United States. So for those people, yes, there is a big war going on, prisoners of war. That's like normal thing, but our Western allies have no idea about the conditions of detention of the civilian prisoners. Probably we need a petition to review this issue during the session of the Organization of the United Nations, and a couple of other tools. I've emphasized a number of our suggestions in our presentation, so we have to look through the whole text to get the whole idea. The role of Ukrainian government, I was already mentioning it, and I emphasize it once again, that the key element of the strategy can only be exercised by the central government of Ukraine, the top level government officials, and the final signature should be made by the President of Ukraine. It should be his decision. He may or may not make this decision, but he should know that he has such an opportunity. The authority has a monopoly for such things as initiation of criminal cases against the Russian government officials who are guilty of illegal abductions, and the process is underway already. Recently, there is a new tool that has emerged, international platform for illegally detained, for the civilians illegally detained by Russia. It emerged in February this year. I'm not sure if this platform will become an efficient tool. Well, I cannot say so because I doubt it, because during the first meeting there were no representatives of Ukrainian civil society, and my experience tells me, well, basically in other words, I'm not aware of a single national initiative that would have been created and implemented without civil society. And this platform did not have any representatives. But if it has a potential to become an efficient tool, it may use this strategy as a foundation for development of their roadmap. So not to start planning things from scratch. And again, here's the link to the full text of the strategy in Ukrainian and English. They are big documents, more than 20 pages each. On the website of the Center for Civil Liberties, you may proceed through these links or QR codes. And the conclusions, the summary. Starting from today, Ukrainian authorities know about the opportunities that they have to set the civilians free. The Center for Civil Liberties continues working. We will keep doing what we can do, and we suggest do the rest in cooperation together to do something that we are not able to do on our own. And I want to thank all of the people who were taking part in creation of this document. Incredible team of Center for Civil Liberties, Ms. Natalia, the experts of the coordination headquarters for treatment of the prisoners of war, Mr. Oleg, our partners, Mr. Oleksandra Matviychuk, and many, many other people. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mykhailo, for such a comprehensive work. And Ms. Victoria, I know there's the journalists, they have a lot of questions already, but first I would like to ask you, is it correct, do we understand it correct, that the coordination headquarters has already supported this initiative? If so, when are we going to proceed to its implementation? So we don't only support, but our experts were taking part in the development and population of this strategy. So talking about its implementation, we absolutely support that all these steps have to be taken. This strategy was first presented in February 2022, and we think that all of the steps should be implemented. What can work and what are the challenges that you see on the way of implementation of the strategy? Well, you know, when we talk about the return of either POWs or civilians, we don't know what factor will be the key factor, so we have to engage all of the possible mechanisms. Well, basically, we cannot say that bringing back the civilians from Russia, those who are illegally detained there, that the government was not taking care of it. Well, that would be a mistake. You know, when the coordination headquarters was established, since the very first day, we were talking about bringing not only POWs but also civilians back, and during the 2 years of work we were able to bring back 147 persons. My colleague is saying about 160. I would like to say even 170 or even 1,000, but unfortunately or fortunately the figure is as it is. In our activity, we are guided by the regulations, and one of such regulations is the Decree 257 that regulates the creation and or establishment and operation of the coordination headquarters. And just recently, regardless of the fact that the work was underway to set the civilians free, we've added more authorizations to us, and now we have an identified body, identified agency, which is in charge of bringing the civilian prisoners back, but we can only work in synergy with the government authorities and in synergy with the non-government sector, human rights organizations, and we do appreciate this cooperation that enables us to plan and adjust our work, and we're always find support on the side of the civil organizations. We find allies among them. Thank you very much, dear journalists. If you have any questions, please let us know.
Media. My question is, are you getting international help besides a handful of Middle East countries that are helping in negotiating release of civilians? We know that they've helped with POWs in the past, but have you seen any change in those international cooperations? Дякую.
The question of a third country, a country that can help us, is something that we keep working on and on since the very first days of the existence of the coordination headquarters. If we have such country identified, well, we would know about it, we would have their official support. The problem is that the choice of the third country is the choice of both parties of the armed conflict. And unfortunately, it's not our fault that such country is not yet identified.
Journalist, I'm from civil society. I have a question on sanction. You ask for also support, help with the international organization. What I know is that in the European Parliament, they are about to discuss the new list of sanctions, which is coming just on time. It will happen on the first week of April. I myself invited on sanction related to the children who are deported, and I will be more than happy to take you on board for the civilian, because this is something which is, we know that you can have an impact and it can make a difference.
Yes, we suggest the idea of the specialized sanction package against the government officials and organizations in the Russian Federation who are guilty of illegal deprivation of freedom of the civilians. We have enough information about who is supposed to be the objective of those sanctions, so we want our allies to understand the importance of this problem. So far, it's not so yet, and we need the political will to do so, and we will assist it to the best extent possible. Thank you very much for your initiative. Please let them know it's really important. More questions?
Morning, Lorenzo Cremonesi from Italian Daily Corriere della Sera. Sir, just to understand a little more about the dimension of this phenomenon, very worrying phenomenon, you say 7,000 estimates missing people, and you said you recognize, you identified around 1,600. Can you tell us roughly, because probably you don't have a precise number, how many were taken between 2014 and before the war, before the last invasion, and since 2022? And secondly, you say there are roughly around 150 detention centers. Can you be more specific? How many are you estimate in the occupied territories? How many are in Russia? Are they different? Are there some worse, some maybe better condition? Are there some place where you can monitor better? This kind of details. Thank you.
Well, first question regarding the number of people who were abducted in the occupied territories before the full-scale invasion. I can tell you it's a very complicated question, because the people were being abducted for different periods with different consequences. And when I'm talking about different periods, some people were detained for like a couple of days. They were told it's a type of verification or screening, but some people were disappearing and we still don't know about their whereabouts. But in any case, we're talking about a large scale, a huge scale operation, thousands of people. talking about the places of detention, yes, we know, thanks to the efforts of the coordination headquarters and our intelligence, we know about 150 such places that are located all the way until the far east of Russia and occupied territories. However, after the annexation of the temporarily occupied territories, there was a Russian so-called legal system established there, and the places of detention are Russian. They submit to the Federal Punishment Service. So from the point of view of the legal status, currently there is no difference where those people are being detained, whether in Russia or temporarily occupied territories. For us, they are the joint group of individuals whose rights are violated. For the time being, I cannot even give you the exact figure, but if you ask me later, I'll give you the exact count. Thank you.
Доброго дня, мене звати
Good afternoon, Maria Shenkarenko, Ukrinform. As Mr. Mykhailo has mentioned, since the beginning of the full-scale war, we were able to bring back 160 civilians. However, the coordination headquarters is giving a different figure, 140 persons. So my question is, which figure is best verified and why are these figures different? Thank you. So how did we come up with 160? 147 that was presented by the coordination headquarters. We've added the last exchange where, according to our estimates, there were civilians. There is a problem, though, an internal Ukrainian problem, identification of a person's status. For example, a border guard who was serving in border guard service. So Russians abducted him from his home. He's non-combatant in these conditions. He was wearing slippers back then as he was abducted. So at that moment he was a civilian, and such cases are numerous. So for some journalists there might be some deviation in numbers. That's not something that should frighten you. It's just that the objective situation is very, very complicated, and we don't always have, as the scientists say, we don't always use the same terminology. Well, you had another questions, right? Thank you very much. Another question is about the following fact. While preparing the strategy, did you add the Ukrainian journalists who ended up in Russian captivity in this figure of Ukrainian civilian prisoners? Do you know about their fate, specifically about Victoria Roshina, Dmitro Kheluk, the journalist of Union, and how can we basically motivate, stimulate Russia to bring Ukrainian journalists back home? Well, of course, we are aware about Mr. Kheluk, about Victoria Roshina. Well, what's the biggest problem? Is that the detaining party, they know for sure where those people are and what's going on about them. If Russia informs us where those people are, we could have this information, but otherwise we can only guess. We can gather information that we get from the prisoners, and obviously we have information about more than 20 journalists who are either abducted or otherwise Russia could have confirmed that they are detained by Russia. But if we already mentioned the journalists, we should mention other categories of population, of civilian population who are non-combatants, like medics, musicians, and so on and so forth. Thank you. More questions, dear friends? Let me add a little bit in response to this question. Of course, we know about those people. Some of our journalists are in this book, in this booklet, but I have a huge request to Ukrainian journalists. When we're saying that our civilians are held captive there, we corroborate the Russian narrative, the Russian idea. I've already mentioned that they respond that people were detained for the resistance of the special military operation, both military and civilian. For them, we are all, you know, whether military or civilians, we are all rebels. For them, it's not a war, it's the rebellion. This is what's happening in their consciousness, and we have to fight on this field of ideas, not to support their narrative. It's a war, there are prisoners of war, and there are civilians. Civilians who were illegally deprived of their freedom, including journalists. Mr. Mykhailo, a question right away then, if we touch upon the topics of narratives, is it okay to call them civilian hostages? The hostages, is it a normal term? Yes, I think in my opinion we can use the term hostages because the Russian Federation detains them illegally. There are no accusations, there are no convictions, there are no court rulings, but they are not being released. However, the international humanitarian law clearly stipulates it. Verification within the shortest term possible and release. So it's either release or initiation of criminal case, but they don't do it. And then we have a reasonable question. Why? Probably Russian regime has some ideas about how to use those individuals, which is a clear sign of them being hostages. So yes, I think we can use this term.
I'd like to understand, that was the spirit of my question before. Can you try in the 7,000 tell us if the majority was taken before the war of 2022 or after? I mean, which proportion is from 2014 till February 2022, and which one is in the last 2 years? That was my question. I would like to understand if the policy is worsening, the Russian repression is worsening, or is similar or less. Thank you.
The majority was detained after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. The problem is that the people who disappeared before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they either have the criminal cases initiated against them with the convictions, or otherwise those people may have disappeared. And those 7,000, they are predominantly the people who were detained after the 24th of February 2022, and some of them have been there for 2 years without court rulings, without convictions, without any legal status. My neighbor in Bucha, Sergei Kuryanov, was detained for being a car mechanic, and like his hands were covered in oil. So Russians were thinking he works with the weapons, and that indicator was enough for them to detain him, and such cases as his are numerous. I apologize, I would like to add about the terminology a little bit. So talking about the way it's governed on a legal level, on the legislation level by the Decree 257, we use the term civilians who were deprived of their personal freedom as a result of the armed aggression. So this is the term that we can also use in relation of the civilian hostages. Thank you. Dear friends, do we have any more questions on the floor? You were mentioning this strategy is developed for the civilians who were illegally detained. Have you come across cases when Ukrainian civilian hostages were illegally convicted without any reason? And in this case, is it possible to help them in any way? Yes, this is another huge problem that we focus on. According to our calculations, about 200 civilians are already convicted or are currently being convicted, and this number is unfortunately growing. The same happens with the prisoners of war. So those criminal cases, They are fabricated, falsified 100%. All those cases that we're aware of are accusations of the people who did not commit any crime. Even the list of articles of the criminal code under which they are convicted is already an evidence of falsification. For example, training for the purposes of terroristic activities. What kind of thing is that? Accidentally I've opened an instruction of how to make an explosive device online. Is it already something that I'm supposed to be convicted for? In the opinion of Russians, it is so. So there is a category, a huge category of Russian law enforcement prosecutors who fabricate all those criminal cases about the prisoners of war, like, for example, Max Butkevich, our friend. And the same thing is with the civilians. It's another huge problem, and we also need another sanction package here. Well, open the strategy and read. More questions? Good afternoon. I would like to touch upon the issue of the civilian prisoners who were deported by Russia from penitentiary system, 3,500 of them after the 24th of February 2022. And when we talk about the period since 2014, it's plus 16,000 in the temporarily occupied territories of Donetsk and Lugansk region. They are also civilians, and some of them really aspire to get back to Ukraine after Ukrainian victory. So let's call it such a conditional term. People who were abducted by Russian Federation, deprived of their freedom, and who are staying in Russian Federation without any legal reasons. I would like to add that yes, that's yet another huge problem, because Russia does not only steal Ukrainian prisoners, they violate their rights. For example, if the article of the criminal code and Russia contemplate different terms, Russians look at it and they add a couple of years to people's sentence. Another huge problem is that after the formal release, in many cases those people just don't have any documents. They are being released, but they are being right away sent to the Center for Detention for Foreign Citizens, where they may spend another 2 years of imprisonment just because Russia abducted a person and they cannot provide the documents for them. Thank you very much. This is where I would like to thank all of you. Thank you for your efforts, for your work on this problem. And I want to thank for this synergy between the civil society and the state. Thank you, dear colleagues, for your interest to this extremely important topic, and I would like also to thank our security and defense forces, thanks to whom we can have events like this. Glory to Ukraine!